Welcome. Washoe County Library welcomes you to our monthly series from the Nevada Historical Society presents High Noon with Neal Cobb. This afternoon's topic is about the Black Rock Desert, a tour through the history and the Applegate Trail with Jim Bonar. My name is Samantha and I'm very happy to be here with you today. Washoe County Library System and Nevada Historical Society will feature a different topic and speaker the third Thursday of every month through January. Next month's topic is the Pony Express in Nevada. This will be on Thursday, January 21st at noon. Be sure to sign up at our event at events.washoecountylibrary.us. This event is live and can be viewed via Zoom or Washoe County Library's Facebook events page. If you miss an event and you want to catch our archived events on our website, you can go to washoecountylibrary.us. And now I'd like to introduce Sherry Hayes Zorn with the Nevada Historical Society. Again, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you everybody for attending today's lecture. The Nevada Historic Society really wants to thank the Washoe County Libraries for working with us to create these programs for High Noon and other programs we've been working with this summer with Art Town, trying to make our lectures available on great, amazing Nevada topics while we're hunkered down, trying to be safe during COVID right now. I want to thank Neal and introduce Neal Cobb, who is our guest curator here at the Nevada Historical Society, a longtime resident and native of Nevada and very passionate about Nevada history. And with his longtime connections, he really is well known in the community and knows a lot of great historians. And so without Neal, we wouldn't be able to continue this program. So without further ado, let me introduce Neal Cobb. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you, Sherry. I love it when somebody says something nice about me because it's not always. It is my pleasure today to introduce Jim Bonar, and you want to always pronounce that correctly. It's Bonar. Right, Jim?
That's very good, Neal.
Very good. I screwed it up the first time I ever had him as a speaker over at Westerners, and I will never forget it. Jim is a locally retired high school teacher, ending his teaching career as a math teacher at Sparks High School. He became interested in roads as a young child in the Green River. That's where he grew up. While watching the traffic going through town on Highway 30, Jim is the current Nevada director and the past president of the Nevada chapter of the Lincoln Highway Association. This encouraged him to study and research many Western events. He is a member of many of our local and state historical societies. So in his retirement activities, he gives presentations of Western historical topics involving immigrant trails and early roads and too many local groups. Now, Jim is a master at research, and he's brought his teaching to the forefront because he makes darn good and sure he's got everything right. He does his homework. Homework rings a bell. And he's always been a delight because he will dress in appropriate attire to make a presentation. We are a bit restricted now with the Zoom. He gets really dressed up when he does the Lincoln Highway with the slicker and the goggles and the whole works. But he goes all out to bring you the best possible presentation that you're going to see involving history. So please welcome Jim Bonar and Along the Applegate Trail.
Well, thank you, Neal. I appreciate all of that. Am I on? Can you hear me all?
Yes.
That's wonderful. The Black Rock Desert is an interesting phenomenon of Nevada. And you can notice from my slide here, I am going to also be talking about a trail called the Applegate Trail. which is the famous trail that went through the Black Rock Desert and made it famous during this period of time. But before we go over the Applegate Trail, before we go over the Black Rock Desert, I've found over the years living here in Nevada that the average individual, even the locals necessarily, know very little about the Black Rock Desert and understand just exactly what it is and what makes it so important in the state of Nevada. I've noticed it's interesting with people people locally. They have a tendency to go west to California, and they very seldomly ever go east or north into the state of Nevada. And so I've made it kind of my objective over the years is to open their eyes up to what more we have in the state of Nevada. And the Black Rock Desert is one of them that I feel is just a very strong, important piece that we have here. Most people should be aware that we live in a very unique area, and this is called the Great Basin. And the Great Basin is a region in the western United States that has no drainage to the ocean. It is very, very unique. There is hardly anything like it in the world. In fact, it is the greatest basin or drainage Great Basin area in the world as per se. The Great Basin Desert, which is one of the largest deserts in the United States, covers an arid expanse of over 210,000 square miles, if you stop and think about that. And looking at the diagram down here, you can see it encompasses most of Nevada, parts of California, parts of Utah, and parts of Idaho. And the interesting thing about the Great Basin is two things. Is on the border of the Great Basin is the highest point in the continental United States, Mount Whitney. And then also in the Great Basin is the lowest point in the continental United States, which is Death Valley. And they are all part of what we call the Great Basin drainage. So when we talk about the drainage, we're talking about none of the rivers or waterways that are subject to this 210,000 miles ever go to the ocean, which is characteristically not the case geographically in the world. So where is it? Well, here's a better little map of it, and you can see it takes up quite a bit of Oregon, mostly us in the state of Nevada. It also includes, believe it or not, a lot of people don't understand, the Mojave Desert, and then it's going to include the desert that we're going to talk about, which is up here, and it's called the Great Basin or the Black Rock Desert. You have the Mojave Basin area, the Great Basin, which is a World Wildlife Federation area, and it's been put into the International Register about 20 years ago. So that's where it is. So why though? What is so important about it? Well, many years ago, they say somewhere around the neighborhood of, who knows, maybe in the Pleistocene, actually, for those of you who know anything about that, the Great Basin is formed by two areas. And I'm only showing one of them. And this one area I'm showing is the area that we have of the Great Basin in Nevada, which is what was called the ancient Lake Lahontan. Over here in Utah is the ancient Lake Bonneville. And both these areas form the Great Basin. And this is an area where it was extremely filled with water. And this water then has caused these areas to be part of this drainage. Now, these are all drained with the exception of, this is one of the left remnants that we have of the Great Basin, and that's Pyramid Lake. Pyramid Lake also with Winnemucca Lake, which most of you aren't aware of, and we'll talk about possibly a little bit about it. Another one of the lakes that is natural to the Great Basin happens to be Walker Lake. So the Humboldt River now flows through this area, and the Great Basin then was uplifted and brought to the level that we have now. Now, this water level, if I was to stand here in the Great Basin area of the Black Rock Desert up in this area, this lake would have been over 500 foot deep from the base of the desert playa at that time. So something must have happened before earlier, and that would have been basically the early history. Now, they pretty well documented that about 10,000 years ago, supposedly, I can't honestly, I'm not an archaeologist, but supposedly about 10,000 years ago, we did have human inhabitants that came down some way or the other over the Aleutian chain and we're not all sure of necessarily how. And they occupied this area. And because we found evidence of this in the Great Basin itself, of these tribes by finding these things called stone crescents. And all over the Great Basin are these stone crescents that you can find. And the archaeologists basically haven't been able to actually figure out what they were and how they were used. Some of them felt that they were used as throwing, kind of like a boomerang or a rock, to go after the small prey that were in the area at the time along the lake. These were found along the shores of this ancient Lake Lahontan. And as the lake diminished, they found that these also diminished down these different layers to what we have today in the Black Rock Desert. Now, the Indians that we have in here now didn't really come until later on, and that's the Paiute tribe. And the Paiute tribe really didn't come until, if I look at my lack of memory here, they didn't come until somewhere around 1200 AD that the Paiutes actually moved in from the Plain State and came into this area. And they're, from what we understand, not necessarily part of the original inhabitants that inhabited Great Basin area during that time. So now, historically, first Europeans, of course, that's always what we talk about, because, you know, history really never starts until we have some white man that shows up, and then we can actually call it history. So the first Europeans that came into the Great Basin area was down lower into the Utah area, and this is Father Escalante and Dominguez that showed up in 1776 and 1777, and also Greases, who showed up in 1776. Now remember, this is just when we were fighting a war, and all of a sudden now you'll notice the Spanish are coming all the way up from Mexico City and starting to come into the areas of southern Utah. The Colorado River, here was the crossing of the Fathers, if you've ever heard about that. The crossing of the Fathers is where Escalante and Dominguez actually crossed this one area of the Virgin River. So they were early on in the early 1800s, late 1800s, I should say. Now, our next most famous European happens to be a young man called John C. Fremont. And John C. Fremont came into the area in 1843. And he followed basically a trail that he shouldn't have been on to start with. But he disobeyed an order, and he was supposed to be going. I'm going to show you this map, and I'm going to talk about the Scott Applegate Trail in a second, but I want to show you where Fremont went. Fremont came down through and into Pyramid Lake area. So he left Oregon, followed the Oregon Trail, and then he came down through Goose Lake, down through 49er Lake. He came down through High Rock Canyon. And instead of going further along like that, he came down through Granite Creek, through the Smoke Creek Desert, and then found Pyramid Lake. Fremont and Carson really never ever came into Washoe County at all. Well, not into Washoe County, I should say, but into the Truckee Meadows, because they continued south, and then they exited out through where it's about Bridgeport right now. So that was Fremont in 1846. Now, that was in early, or 1843, I should say. So now, in 1846, we have a very, very important event happen, and this is what's called the Scott Applegate Trail. And this is when Mr. Applegate and his brother, two brothers, both of the brothers, they needed to find a trail that got them to Oregon by not going through the Dalles of the Columbia River. So what they did is they back-trailed from the Willamette Valley, following basically Fremont's route that was well marked, by the way, by his diaries, into the area of High Rock Canyon. And then they know they needed to be able to go over somehow east to be able to pick up the Humboldt River Trail that was the immigrant trail at that time. So Levi Scott, Jesse and Lindsay Applegate wanted to find this trail. And the reason that the Applegates wanted to is because each one of them had lost a son on the river as they were going down the Columbia River. The two sons fell off of the boats that were carrying the goods and drowned. And so the Applegates decided that they would find a much better trail. So what I'm going to be dealing with today is we're going to be dealing with this part of the Black Rock Desert, which actually this is all the Black Rock Desert. It ends kind of down here in the Smoke Creek Desert area, but it takes up most of this area of the state of Nevada. And this would be what is now considered the Lassen, the Applegate Trail, I mean, through High Rock Canyon, up through 49er Lake into Surprise Valley, and then into California. So one of the major important things is this trail was all possible because of a little thing called Rabbit Hole Springs, which is kind of a fascinating little adventure, why we would call it that, but we'll talk about that here in a second. The other trail that we need to deal with, and this is called the Lassen Immigrant Trail. It was 1847 to 1848. Peter Lassen had come to California, and he owned a ranch that he had been able to secure through the rights of Mexico. He converted himself to Catholicism. He agreed that he would then become a Mexican citizen, and so they gave him an acreage of land down in this area here. And he wanted to make a similar situation that Sutter had as a fort. So what he needed to do is he needed to get the immigrants from the immigrant trail over here on the Humboldt, and he needed them to come across to his area to settle. Now I want you to look at the date. This is 1847, 1848. This is before the gold rush. So we're just dealing with immigrants that are coming into California to settle. So what he did is he had them use the Applegate Trail up to Clear Lake and Tule Lake, and then he figured that's the best way now. I should be able to go south, and I should be able to pick up my house. The problem is he got lost, and the only reason he actually survived is that there was a group of immigrants now that were coming from Oregon during this time and had actually now heard about this gold rush, and they actually found Lassen and brought his people into California and saved them from demise. Actually, Lassen it was a point the people were actually going to hang him from the wagon tree of the wagons because they were so upset that they were lost by this man who was supposed to have known the way. If any of you are interested in an interesting story through the Applegate Trail, there's a wonderful little book out called Bruff's Wake. And it talks about an experience that I'm going to go over here a little bit here in a second after the Lassen Trail. And it's going to talk about this 49ers, how they came to California using this. And what we call this is we call this the death route of 1849. Rabbit Hole Springs was a very important place because as the Applegates were coming across, they couldn't find any water. And they were about ready to give up. And one of them, I don't know which one, it was Lindsay, I think, spotted some rabbit trails that were going up into the brush. And as it was going up into the brush, he noticed that they all converged on this one little kind of grassy meadow. And so he looked at it and he dug it around a little bit and he found this little seepage of water. And so he was able to now be able to make it from one of the springs that he had left at Black Rock down to this Rabbit Hole Springs, and then further on to Antelope Springs, and then further on to Lassen Meadows. So because of Rabbit Hole Springs, they were actually able to open this trail up. So the death route of 49 is kind of an interesting little trip. And we use it primarily for why is it called the death route? If you look at this route that they were talking about, I'm going to go back to a previous slide to this death route. One of the things, if you look down here, later arrivals, Bluff counted 82 dead oxen, 2 dead horses and mules laying within a range of 1/10 of a mile. He counted well over 300 or 400 dead oxen and mules and different horses as they were going across this area, trying to get along this route up the Applegate Trail and to get into following the Lassen Trail down into Lassen. Lots of different stories are about it. It's a very interesting story that Bluff writes in his book. There is a couple of other literature about it, but it was a very arduous journey for all of these individuals in 1849. Now, what happened that was kind of critical about it, and I'll show you on this next map here before we talk about the Nobles route, but down in this area, this was the Humboldt Trail or the California Trail that took us down to Donner Pass through the Truckee River Trail, or took us to the Carson Trail up over Carson Summit and then into Placerville. In 1849, there were over 22,000 individuals on this trail coming down the California Trail. It was kind of noted in the diaries that somewhere in the neighborhood of over 11,000 of them made it past Lassen Meadows and went on to California. But for some reason, right during one time, one of the leaders of one of the groups, who was a well-known guide, and everybody behind him knew about this man, he decided to take off and go on to the Applegate Trail. Now, for what reason, we don't know he decided to do that. But he went off onto the Applegate Trail and started to follow this, quote, death route that we call it. Now, that would have been all right because he had a few wagons. But the problem is that the rest of the 11,000 people followed him. Now, if you've ever been into this area up here, I want you to notice that there is not a lot of forage for animals to be able to exist. And so after the first few thousand people went through, all of this area in this place was depleted of any grasses for the animals to subsist on. And Rabbit Hole Springs had become dried up. Antelope Springs had become quite dried up. And so they had to make it almost this whole distance up to Black Rock Point where there was a spring full of water. So there was a lot of loss in life between this 11,000 people, between people and also oxen and cattle. There was one of them who wrote in his diary that said you could walk the total length to Black Rock Desert and never leave stepping on the carcass of an animal. I think that was a small exaggeration, but it's relatively true as far as that goes. So the next little great adventure that kind of happened in the Black Rock area was in the Nobles Trail, and the Nobles Trail was in 1852. In 1852, remember this is after the gold rush time, and so there was a lot of prospecting going on throughout everywhere in California, up in this area and all over, looking for gold all over this area. And so we had a man named Nobles out of Shasta City who needed to be able to, he talked them into agreeing to let him build a road across to the Humboldt Trail to bring these immigrants that are going to the gold fields across over to Shasta City so that they can then develop this area of Shasta City and this area up in the Siskiyous out of the Pitt River area. So he got the people convinced and he went across down through this area now. This is, I can't remember the highway name, but this is a neat highway to get over to Shasta City today, down through what is today Susanville. And then he picked up the trail at Rabbit Hole Springs. Right here is Granite Creek. This is where today's Gerlach is. And so this is where he first found this area. And you'll notice that there was a springs here, there was a springs here, and there was also a few springs across here in Nobles Trail. And also we had water that we could get from Honey Lake area and that area. So the Nobles Trail in 1852 became a very, very important trail up through the 1860s. And an awful lot of Teamster travel started to use this trail instead of using this trail going up through Black Rock Canyon, up through High Rock and into California. They started using the Nobles Trail itself to get to California. Another kind of offshoot for it, which is kind of interesting, is during this time in the 1860s, there was a big gold rush up in Idaho and a silver rush, if you remember, up in the Idaho area. And so many people were actually coming out of California using the Nobles Trail, picking up this corridor trail out of Lassen and then going up into Idaho. So this was heavily, heavily traveled in the 1860s as far as the trail goes through the Black Rock Desert. One of the things that we don't talk about too much is in Nevada history. If you've taken Nevada history, you probably learned one thing about the Indians, and you learn always about the Pyramid Lake Indian War. But then that's the last of it. You don't hear a great deal, which is kind of sad because there was a lot of difficulty with the Indians during this time. And the Indians were becoming quite dismayed with the amount of individuals that were starting to come in. They were cutting down the timber on the Humboldt Trail. They were digging up the roots that the Indians supplied their food for the winter through along the Humboldt Trail along the river. And so there was a lot of difficulties during this time between 1850s and the 1860s of immigrants coming into Nevada, and it was upsetting them. So there was a situation out of Honey Lake in 1865 where there was some cattle that were stolen. So a gentleman named Captain Almond Wells was sent in to solve this problem and get the perpetrators who had taken this cattle. So he was sent into this one area outside of Honey Lake, just in the Smoke Creek Valley area, just above Gerlach, to settle this problem and get these perpetrators and bring them to trial. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to spend a few minutes, and I'd like to read you his report that he wrote back about his little experience of finding these Indians. You'll find this interesting. So this is his report that he wrote to his command officer. He says, immediately upon my arrival, I learned from good authority that the Indians who had been stealing cattle and were constantly making depredations among the ranchmen and settlers thereabouts were of the Smoke Creek tribe, and that a band of them was encamped about 11 miles further on. I placed a strict guard over a few apparently friendly Indians who had been prowling around my camp to prevent communications during the night with those below. And at 3 o'clock the next morning, I started for their encampment, taking with me 29 men and 2 civilians who volunteered their services as guides, the balance of the command still acting as guard over those arrested the night before. At 5:30 a.m., I came in sight of the encampment, halted, and divided my men into 3 squads. I rode towards their camp with the purpose of arresting and taking prisoners among them who had been guilty of cattle stealing and various other crimes. But when within 150 yards, they commenced firing upon me. The first shot took effect in Corporal Dillon's shoulder, wounding him slightly. The third shot passed through the cape of my overcoat. I then ordered a charge with sabers, driving the Indians back into the bushes on each side of the slough. By the time the men under Sergeant Wedley and Barrest came up and a general engagement ensued, the Indians fought desperately, using their guns as clubs in hand-to-hand combat with my men. I followed them for about 10 miles up into the mountains, killing 29 in all, but 1 escaped. Some old muskets, a quantity of ammunition, provisions, etc. were destroyed. I also captured 9 horses, but they were in too poor conditions to bring in. I was highly pleased with the conduct of my men, and they were cool and collected as though on an ordinary saber drill. To much praise cannot be awarded them. Now, here's the irony of the story. Captain Wills had a total of 29 men with him, and he wound up killing all of the Indians, which were 29. And he basically said they fought like veterans. Now, when the news media picked up this, Captain Wells was criticized very, very severely because of the 29 that were killed, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 to 15 squaw and children that were also killed. So it was a very disagreeable event that Captain Wells basically was felt by his superiors that this story wasn't true. And now this caused a great deal of trouble because a few months later, we have what is called the Granite Creek Massacre. Now, I want to look back at Captain Wells. Of these 29 individuals that he murdered as Indians, and this was considered a skirmish. So even though these 29 were killed, this was not considered a massacre. This was considered to be a skirmish. Now, the Granite Creek Massacre was a little different. The Granite Creek Massacre occurred because some transient around Granite Creek, for some reason, killed an Indian. Now, the Indians got a little upset with that, and so they came down to Granite Creek, and they killed 3 white men at Granite Creek, which is today Gerlach. So the massacre occurred of 3 white individuals dying. Where Captain Wells, in his little skirmish, we had over 29 Indians were killed, but that was not a massacre. So this bit escalated even further to an individual called Black Rock Tom. And Black Rock Tom was one of the Northern Shoshone Paiutes who had decided that he was going to somehow keep these people out of his area. And so he started causing a great deal of trouble, and he was stealing cattle. He was going out to the ranches and he was killing people. And so now it was up to Captain Wells once again to go out and find Black Rock Tom. Now, Black Rock Tom is interesting because he is the one who was responsible for the murder of Colonel. Now, see, I'm having a senior moment now. Sorry, I lost the name. What's the little town up above? Anyway, I'll think of it here in a minute. It was the leading officer, and I've forgotten the name. I apologize for that. So they were after Black Rock Tom, and they finally did manage to capture Black Rock Tom in what was called a gallant fight at Fish Creek Valley. Now, Fish Creek Valley is an interesting little story all on its own. The Granite Creek Massacre, like I said, was just basically 3 individuals that were killed by the Indians. Captain Wells himself, remember, he sent a large group of individuals in and killed 29 Indians, but it was just a normal little saber drill. Finding Black Rock Tom was a little more difficult. And so finding him, they did originally find his camp, but unfortunately Black Rock Tom did get away and he did cause some more trouble. And he was holed up in the Black Rock Desert. Now, the Fish Creek Valley incident was really kind of interesting because they knew where these Indians were. And this was in February. And they sent the men out in the morning, and they had to march somewhere around 20 miles. And you can see from this little picture an indicator of what it was like to go this distance. And their scouts had found where this group of Indians were, and so they had to wait until morning came out. So to keep warm, what the men did is they formed a circle. And in this circle, what they did is they marched for about 3 hours in this circle, back and forth, around and around and around. And still many of them suffered from loss of limbs of their fingers and feet before they were ever to go into this excursion with these Indians. They did go in and they did manage to capture the Indians. It was a full out war again. Most of the Indians were killed. There were something like 2 or 3 squaws that were killed, but they did capture most of the women and children and bring the children back to the area where they could then put them into the reservations and take care of the area. And this was kind of the end of the Indian problems as far as that goes. So let's talk a little bit about the Black Rock, and let's do a little tour of the Black Rock area. We are unique because the Black Rock is under the Bureau of Land Management, and it is a national conservation area. It's protected. You can go in, you can use the area. It's very well open to public use, but you are responsible to, as we like to say, to take only pictures and leave only footprints. You are responsible to take out all of everything, your trash, your waste, and everything. There are a few areas where there are some campgrounds that do have facilities, but if you're going to dry camp yourself, you are required, hopefully, to use some kind of a medium that you take out your own waste. Back in this area, it's kind of neat because this is all a wilderness area, and this is the Twin River area, which we're going to talk a little bit about. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of follow the Applegate Trail. This is where the Humboldt Corridor started down here at what we call Lassen Meadows at the Rye Patch Reservoir. And we're going to follow the Applegate Trail up through the Black Rock Desert. The Nobles Trail would have gone then across here into Gerlach and out that way. But the Applegate Trail itself goes up through the middle up to Black Rock Springs, Double Hot Springs, and into the High Rock Desert, and Soldiers Meadow, the High Rock Desert, and then out into California. So these maps are available online through the BLM, and so you can find them. And here's a little bit closer area to it. One of the things that's interesting about the Black Rock is most people think that it's just a playa. Well, this is the playa that you see the pictures of, okay? Well, this whole area is the Black Rock Desert. It's not a playa like all of you feel it is. This is the one playa, which is called the sink of the Queens River, or actually what it is, the Quins River. And like everything else in the Great Basin, this is one of the sinks. Remember, we have the sink of the Humboldt, we have the sink of the Walker, we have the sink of the Carson, we have the sink of the Truckee, and we have the sink of the Seaver, we have the sink of the Weaver. We have all of these different sinks that all of these rivers in this area go into and never go to the ocean. So first of all, if you are interested in taking a tour of this trail down the road, you can very well go online to Trails West Inc., and you can get yourself a nice guide to the Applegate Trail and the Lassen Meadows, and it will give you all of the information that you need to know on how to take this trail driving wise and what to look for. It's a wonderful, wonderful little publication. This is a member of one of the groups that I do belong to, and we're responsible for marking these trails, and I'll show you how this is done. So for instance, here is our first marker, and this is called a T marker. This is 2 T markers because there happens to be 2 T trails here. This T is a little railroad track here, and this indicates that this is the direction that the California Trail went, and this one on top is the direction of where the Applegate Trail is. So this is the junction as the Applegate, Lassen, Noble Trail and the California Immigrant Trail going down to the 40-mile desert into Truckee and Carson City. Here's the Humboldt River, just at Rye Patch Reservoir, just where this trail starts. So this is the start of our trail. This is called Lassen Meadows. There was a lot of grass here at that time when the immigrants came through. So if they were smart enough, they could actually cut the grass and take it with them before they went across the different trail. But here's what it looks like in most of the way. Now this is a shot that is past a little bit where we started from, and you can see right out here is the Black Rock. And we're not there yet. We're over another spot, but I wanted to show you kind of what it looked like to go across this place if you were in a wagon train and you were looking for something to feed your animals with. One of the interesting little things that you can find on the trail, and it's marked in the book, is the Susan Coon grave. And there's actually 3 graves here. And these were graves in the 1849s during this part that I was talking about called the Death March. And this is a spot called Antelope Springs, where was the first springs off of the Humboldt River that people would stop at Antelope Springs. And this is where, obviously, at this case, they had some loss of life, and they did bury their dead in this point. Here's Antelope Springs itself. Now, there isn't much to see. You can see that the springs itself is up into this area here where you can see the cottonwoods. But if you look around, you'll notice it's pretty barren otherwise. And so there was just enough water to be able to give water and grass to the first of the few thousand immigrants that came through. And the other 9 or 10,000 after that really were kind of weak when they got to this point because all the grass was depleted and so was all of the water. Now this is looking from Antelope Springs up over Antelope Pass. So this would have been from Antelope Springs what you would have had to cross with your wagon to the next available water hole, which was Jackrabbit Springs. Jackrabbit Springs is over the top of Antelope Springs. We drop down into the Quinn area sink, and then we can find the water there at Jackrabbit Springs, and then we can go on to the Black Rock to find the next water hole there. Now, this is how big Jackrabbit Springs is. You can see that there's not much there. It's been dug out over the last couple of centuries. And when I was there the last few times, there was very little water in it since we've been in a drought situation. Now, one of the things I need you to remember is that the bulk of these people are coming over this area in September and August. In August. Now, what is the temperature of this area in August? It's up around 105 degrees. So it's very hot, there's no water, and this grass, by the time that some of the immigrants came through there, all of this grass would have been depleted, and they were now out of fodder for their animals. This is one of the T markers. Here's one of the sayings: got to Rabbit Hole Springs about dark and camped. The water is not good to drink. The boys had to dip up water in pails to water the stock, had no grass, only a little hay with us. And this was in 1854 after the gold rush. Now, it's interesting because in 1854, they really should have known better than to be onto this trail. Now, this is looking from the top of Antelope Springs, Antelope Summit again, and now here we can see what we're after. Here is the Black Rock. This is the famous Black Rock. We know that once we get to the Black Rock, down below it here is the next water. This area that you see down here is the Quinn River Sink. And it's interesting, if you ever decide to go out there in the spring, don't go out and do the Applegate Trail, because this is a big, big marshy area where the Quinn River is full of water, and you will definitely get your truck stuck. So what we're doing is we're looking at this area, right around in this area. We've continued over here. We're now down, going onto the playa, heading towards the Black Rock. This is a shot I took of us coming across the playa in one of the Jeep trips I took. This is actually one of the neatest things you can do out there, is you can get out and drive on the playa. As a lot of you should know, is the playa is used as a land speed record area also. And many of the land speed records have been set out on the Black Rock Playa, and it's just beautifully flat. And you can get out there and just go as fast as you possibly can. But I would suggest you do it after the wet season. So this was on a camping trip that I was on here about 3 or 4 years ago. I was leading a Jeep trip through there on the Applegate Trail, and it was just absolutely enjoyable traveling through this playa. I took this shot because I was out there on Labor Day with doing the trail and taking a guide. And this is a shot of the dust from Burning Man. And so I found it kind of interesting because we had no dust, but the problem is here's the Black Rock, and this is where we were going to camp. And so I was a little concerned that there was going to be a lot of dust at our camp area where we were going to camp. But it turned out okay. But you can imagine what it would have been like for these people at Burning Man during this time with that playa dust up at that time. Here's a shot of the Quinn River. This would have been during the spring. I didn't take this picture. I downloaded this from another trip that I was on during the spring. So when we were over there during our October trips, there is no water in it. And you can see once again, here's the little place we're going to, the Black Rock Desert. And we have to now cross this in our Jeep, and or in your case, it would have been a wagon if you were an immigrant. And there's the Black Rock. Here we are at Black Rock Springs. Black Rock Springs is really neat. It's a great place to camp. It's warm water. It's about 104 degrees. There's a little pier there that you can get out on, and you can take a dip. It's about, probably maybe waist, shoulder deep at the most. Little silty bottom, so you have to get used to having your feet and your toes into mud. But you can go out and camp out there. There's no facilities, no water and no toilet. And so you can go out and camp, set up your camp anywhere you want, and you can soak in Black Rock Springs. It's just a neat little area to camp. Up the road from Black Rock Springs, the next one that the immigrants would hit is a place called Double Hot Springs. Now, this is critical, and this is very important that people understand that. This water is in excess of 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's been many cases when people have brought their animals and their dogs out with them, unfortunately, and the dogs have jumped in the water and been scalded to death. And there's one immigrant who made that statement. And there was one immigrant, it was kind of interesting, and I didn't believe it, but they actually had a chicken still with them, and they actually boiled some eggs. I find that hard to believe that the chicken actually made it this far. This is a picture of the Double Springs. They're just absolutely beautiful to see. They're laden with minerals, and this picture doesn't do it justice as this water is swelling up from down below from the magma underneath. And it's just a beautiful sight to be able to see, and it's really worth your while to drive out there someday to see this area. Black Rock Springs, then, here's the second one. It's called Double Hot Springs. And you can see the two different springs as we're talking about. And then what it does is it eventually goes out into the desert out here into the sink, and it cools down and isn't as bad. Now, one of the interesting areas I want to talk about is a place called Hardin City. And this is going to come back here in a second. Hardin City is where there was a silver mine. And Mr. Hardin was an individual that came across in 1849, and he was a scout for them, and he was up in the area, and he looked down and he found a piece of what he thought was lead, and so he needed some bullets. And so he went back to his campsite and he melted his bullets down and made his bullets and put the rest of the lead in his saddlebags. And 9 years later, he took it out and he had it there, and he took it down and he had it assayed, and it was silver instead of leads. So he was actually making silver bullets instead of lead bullets. So there was a rush to this area. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a second. In the 1860s, and they opened up this area called Hardin City, and it was supposed to be just a wonderful, wonderful place that everything was happening and all kinds of stuff were happening. And many, many, many people came to Hardin City to look for the silver. And the irony of the whole thing is that despite everything, there was never a bit of silver ever found, even though the amount of money was spent in assaying this and saying that there was silver there. The only thing left is the road. There is no buildings left or anything. Fascinating little piece of history. Now, what's Hardin City got to do with it? Well, when Hardin went back to look for it, along with him went Peter Lassen. And Peter Lassen and two other individuals were looking for the other group that was looking for the Hardin gold mine. And they were camped in this one area off of the Black Rock Desert. And in the evening, an Indian came up to the three of them, and he asked whether he could get some help with some shot and some lead. Well, Peter Lassen was friends with the Indians, and so he gave the Indians some shot and some lead, and then that was it. Now, the next morning, supposedly his friend, Edward Culper, his name was, and Louis Wyatt was woke up to a shot, and he looked around and he knew that Mr. Culper was dead. And he looked around and he didn't see anything, and Peter Lassen heard the shot, and so Peter Lassen grabbed his gun and stood up, and then Peter Lassen was shot. So Mr. Wyatt then managed to find his horse that had run off. Now, Mr. Wyatt is a 200-pound man, and he found his horse without saddle, and he rode 100 miles back to Honey Lake to tell about this story of Peter Lassen being murdered by the Indians. Now, when they came back up to the campsite with the group from Honey Lake to bury the bodies of Peter and Culper, they found that the campsite hadn't been disturbed at all. And it's a rule of case, usually if this had been an Indian situation, it would have been ransacked and all of the goods would have been taken. But there was nothing disturbed whatsoever. So it still is a mystery now after so many hundreds of years, just exactly who killed Peter Lassen. Was it a disgruntled one of his ex-person? Was it Wyatt himself? Or who it was? And today we still don't know. And if you drive up this canyon, there's a neat little monument up there that you can see for Peter Lassen. Remember, there's all kinds of things named for him in California where he's famous for. One of the nice things about the Black Rock Desert, just like in the rest of northern Nevada, is the wonderful sunsets that we have. And it's always wonderful. This is from Soldier Meadows, where we were camped on the second night. So one nice thing about a few of the campsites is Soldiers Meadows has actually a BLM campsite further up. And there's a, I'm going to show you the picture of that here in a second. There's a place where you can actually get into the water and bathe a little bit if you'd like. But we decided this year that we weren't going to go up to the campsite. We decided we would stay down at this cabin. The cabin is a first come, first serve. You're welcome to use it. There are some supplies in it, and you're asked if you use something to deplete it with your own, to add it to your own. And so this is my family, and we're camped on Labor Day up there, and we're having a wonderful time. And the next, that evening, what we did is we went up and we soaked in the hot springs. And up in Soldiers Meadows, they've cordoned off, so there's about 7 or 8 different pools that you can get into and enjoy a little bit of a place. Now, this is right at the campground itself if you decide to go up to Soldiers Meadow and to camp up in Soldiers Meadow. So as we look at our map here, we can see that we're following the trail up here. This is where, this area here is where the Lassen murder site was. And what we're doing is we're going to go up, and we were up at Soldiers Meadows here, and now we're going to continue down, and we're going to go into the important part that is really the most valuable part of our Black Rock Desert, and that's the High Rock Canyon Wilderness area. This is High Rock Lake here, but there's a wonderful thing. This is called Fly Canyon, and it's just an unbelievable piece of history. So this is driving into Fly Canyon. Fly Canyon is down here in this aurora, and the immigrants would have been coming this direction up on top of where we are here now, and they're going to have to now get down into Fly Canyon. This is a drawing that Goldbuff drove of leaving that area that I just showed you and going down into Fly Canyon. And this is his drawing of them pulling the wagons down through this slope. Now, what they would do is they would chain the wheels of the wagons, and then they would let them pull down. And normally there were men behind them also tugging on the wagons to get down through here. Here is the trail that they had to bring the wagons down. Now, I'm up on top of the plateau up here, and my son is down here at the bottom, and you can see the distance it takes to be able to get these wagons down this groove down into the bottom of Fly Canyon so they can continue their journey. This is a look a little bit down. You can see the slope. You can actually see a little bit of a wagon trace still left here. Fly Canyon, it's a really fascinating spot. Now, once they left Fly Canyon, they would go down Fly Canyon, and they would follow along the side here and then up down into High Rock Canyon Lake and then up into High Rock Canyon. This is the picture that Goldbuff he drew of High Rock Canyon. It doesn't look quite like this, but there's an interesting little cave here I'll show you a picture of. And this is his rendition of Fly Rock Canyon, or High Rock Canyon. And this is what it really looks like. So here is High Rock Canyon. It's just absolutely beautiful to go through. You really need to do it. If you have a high clearance vehicle, it's accessible to almost any high clearance vehicle to be able to take this trip. This is the cave that you can go into. It's an ancient cave that the Indians used. It's not very high, it's not very deep. And they called it the post office cave because people would leave messages on the cave wall or around the walls of the cave itself. And here's just a shot of us waiting for our Jeep group to get together. And you can see why it's called High Rock Canyon. It's just absolutely beautiful. Another shot of it going down through one of the meadows. Now, one of the fascinating things is the colors that you see up in the High Rock Desert. And this is called Yellow Rock Canyon. And this picture doesn't do it justice. And this yellow rock is just absolutely spectacular to see. Yellow Rock Canyon goes up this way. We're traveling in this direction. And right here is a little building that actually, believe it or not, was the High Rock Garage. Now, I have no idea when they were using it. It was somewhere evidently in the 20s. I don't think it did very well because I don't think the traffic was that great up the High Rock Canyon getting into Idaho or Oregon. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to see. This is called the Upper High Rock Canyon. You're going to leave it and go down through this gorge. And following, you can see there's a wet, so you do have some water coming through here, keeping some greenery, fortunately. So there was always water once they reached the High Rock area. Now, one of the things that we're fortunate about is in this situation, the BLM has managed to cordon off the road. The road is up here. And if you look very carefully, these are the wagon traces that were left between 1846 and the 1860s of the wagons going up through this area. And it's really kind of a spectacular find to be able to get up there and see these wagon traces. Now, Massacre Lake and Massacre Ranch is an interesting story, and it's up at the top of High Rock Canyon. And the fascinating thing about it is there was never any massacre up here. Evidently, somebody sometime found something and they decided that there had been a massacre up here, and so it got that name. And so what can you say? There's a private ranch up there, and so if you hear and or see of Massacre Lake and Massacre Ranch, there was no massacre up there. Okay, just to finish up a little bit here, I want to show you what it was like to camp out on the playa. This is the way my wife and I camped when we were out on the playa, and when we actually go across the High Rock, when we had our Jeep. And you can see we're quite comfortable, set up quite well. You'll notice that we do have an ample supply of water. We'd also have extra gas, which is very well needed. Now we were kind of the poor white trash because the real campers, they had a tent on a trailer, for instance, like this, and so they were really, really quite comfortable because they were off the ground where where we weren't. Now, my biggest problem is that being my age, I have to get up frequently during the night for a little service. And so I would have found it very difficult to get down this ladder to do what I was supposed to do. So this was one of them. Another one of them, here's an interesting little item for you that they're doing now, is you put your tent on top of your Jeep. But you can see the same still problem as there is you still have that ladder that you have to use. And so that makes it kind of interesting as far as that goes. Was there one trip we had a little hovercraft, whatever they call those darn little things that people done, and this was our camp that we had out on the playa that night with everybody set up. And you'll notice that most of us, here's my little unit here, and you can see that most of them had different types of units for their Jeeps. Out here, is you can see, is the part of the Black Rock, and here is the playa that you would be familiar with from what you're seeing. Once again, another shot of going across the playa. This is just absolutely, like I said, just wonderful fun. Now, to get an idea of what's going on here really is we were in the area that we were up in this area here. This is the playa that you're all familiar with. And this is the amount of area that Burning Man takes up compared to the Black Rock Desert. This out here is all the Black Rock Desert. This is not the whole totality of the Black Rock Desert. There's this huge playa up into this Quinn River. This is actually looking south, come to think of it, towards Gerlach. And this is the Smoke Creek Desert area. So I'm sorry, I got confused. We would have been down in this far end down here. Looking at what Burning Man consists of, you can see it consists just of this one small area, and the Black Rock Playa itself extends out here another 50 miles as it goes. And so it takes up very little of the Black Rock Desert and very little of the playa itself. Another shot just to give you an idea of the immense size of the Black Rock Desert. Here's the Smoke Creek Desert down here. Gerlach is in this area. Burning Man would have been here. High Rock Canyon is way up in this area here. And the Applegate Trail was across in this area going over to the Black Rock. One of the unique features now is what's called the fly geyser. The fly geyser is not a natural made. They were actually doing a geothermal well drilling, and they didn't cap it too well in the 60s. And so it became a geyser. And since 1963, I think it was, it has been able to create this, this wonderful thing that now is on private property, and you need to have permission to go in and take a tour of it. And here we are, my wife and myself on our Jeep. So I want to thank you very much. And there is basically my little history of the Black Rock Desert. I didn't cover everything because there is an immense amount of history up there, and I can't do it within an hour. But those of you who have the ability, please take some time and go up to the Black Rock and see the splendor that we have in northern Nevada as part of our state in this conservation area. So we will send you off now to our, whoever is leading this program now. Is it Neal?
Well, number one, we want to thank you for another wonderful program. I wanted to talk just a little bit about your magazine that you were so busy selling when you were president. And we have other copies of this. This is a great magazine. We just have a wonderful time. I look forward to it every issue. So there's so much to do in the state of Nevada, and there's a whole lot of it that revolves around the Lincoln Highway, which you are a resident expert on, and you have done many programs for us on that. You were the president for quite some time, probably 10 years. But now we have Cindy Ainsworth, and she is a go-getter and a wonderful lady too. And she's really trying to bring a lot of attention to something that was so incredibly important as far as the national history and the great state of Nevada. Did you get all of that?
Yep, got all that. Also, just to make a point.
Sorry about that.
Otherwise,
just to make a point, Neal.
I don't know, Sharon, should we open it up for questions?
Just one more.
I do have a couple questions from Edith. She said, couldn't see the magazine. Could you give the title of what the magazine was again?
Well, the title of the magazine is the Lincoln Highway Forum. And by becoming a member of the Lincoln Highway Association, this is the magazine that they send out.
Okay.
You can't buy these at the grocery store or any place else. You must be a member of the Lincoln Highway Association, as far as I know.
If I could take a second. Really, also, one thing I do really want to point out, and I know, Neal, thank you for pushing that. But another thing, one of the wonderful organizations that I belong to is the Oregon-California Trail Association. And the Oregon-California Trail Association, if you are interested in trails in the West itself, we have a wonderful publication that's similar to the journal with the Lincoln Highway Association, and it's called the Overland Journal. And it is just a absolutely wonderful magazine that talks about the history of all of the overland trails going west from Missouri during that time, and a lot of good history with it. So we have a wonderful lot of organizations out there, like the Historical Society itself, the Nevada Museum, the Sparks Museum. Oh, it's just, it's incredible. And my wife gets very upset about the amount of money I spend for memberships. But anyway, that's the way it goes.
There's another one that had a bit of luck, and that's the Verdi History Center. The county donated, or the school district donated, the school that's there on Bridge Street, and they're going to be able to expand.
Well, we do have another
one-man operation.
They are a good operation. And I do have another question. It is for somebody who's never been out to the Black Rock. What's the most important thing that maybe you should know or plan for if you wanted to be brave enough to go in and explore out there? You know, you mentioned gas and water, high vehicle. Is there also like a Jeep group or, you know, anything you might be able to recommend, Jim?
Uh, just make sure that you have an adequate vehicle, probably some kind of an SUV with high clearance. Uh, Make sure that you go on to the BLM land, the BLM, what shall I call it? BLM site, for instance, and um, look at this one map. Okay, look at this one map of they have, and there are lots of roads that you can take, for instance, that you're not on a rugged trail. There's one highway that you go up all the way to Soldiers Meadow, for instance, that you can get into High Rock Canyon and see it that way. But I think the must that everybody should see if they ever go to it is to go and at least drive through High Rock Canyon. That is
Okay.
probably more important than anything else. Just make sure that you have a spare tire. Make sure that you possibly have your cell phone with you. I always recommend people to go at least with 2 to 3 people in 2 to 3 different vehicles. Um, I've been out in the desert where I've actually had 3 flat tires. So I'm not saying this area is, but Nevada is a very difficult place sometime to be off road. So just take care, take lots of water, make sure you always have blankets with you no matter what, because even in the summer, our nights get quite cold. I
Did
hope
you
that
think
helps.
of that? Did you think of the name of the city above Gerlach?
Denial,
Denial?
yes.
No.
That
It
was
always comes a little later, doesn't it, Jim?
that was Colonel Denial that was killed by Black Rock Tom.
Yeah. So
Okay.
we got it in.
Well, we do have another question. Are you familiar with the Chico Trail that ran from Chico through Susanville up through the Black Rock Desert to Pueblo, Oregon?
Well,
Are
that's
you,
part.
you know, since you're kind of dealing with routes, do you know about that
Yeah,
trail?
that was part of the Lassen Trail, and it was that is actually the Peter Lassen Trail. Uh,
Oh,
it went up to Oregon, but the Chico Trail was a combination of the Applegate Trail and the Lassen Trail. Um, Bidwell, Mr. Bidwell is the one who started Chico, I think. And what they did is they picked up the Lassen Trail that goes up basically following Interstate. Right now, it's following Interstate. What is that? 5. That goes up to the Siskiyous. So, yeah, there was an awful lot of 49er migration that left Willamette Valley coming down to the gold fields in California. And so there was quite a few trails that were initiated and made during 1849, 1850, and 1851, and the Chico Trail being one of them.
oh, okay. Okay. Well, we have Marcel said Massacre Rim is a beautiful dark sky sanctuary, but anywhere is really beautiful to watch stargazing in the Black Rock because you know you're out in the desert and it's really quite open. So
Really see this.
It is nationally known as one of the darkest places in the country.
that's amazing. I know up in Glacier Park where I have a family up there, they go up towards the top and they do stargazing up there too. So it's quite dark and you can really see in the distance. So, well, I don't see any other questions so far. Do you have any final little comments or anything else you'd like to mention, Jim or Neal?
Well, next month's program is Sam. Okay, pronounce his last name,
Macalusa.
Macaluso, and he's going to do a program on the Pony Express.
Yep.
And we look forward to that. He's a very charismatic individual, and he likes to get into it and really tell the story.
Yes, and
Yeah.
he's wonderful educational docent that gives great tours and does outreach for the Historical Society as well. So,
And we need to point out that the Pony Express Trail is where the Lincoln Highway finally went up going.
yes,
Yeah, there we go. Lincoln Highway in
it
there.
all circles around.
Well, thank you
Is
very
there
much
any
for
final?
inviting me.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Samantha, do you have any final comments for us? And thank you so much for helping us get this great program out.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all for joining us. Thank you, Sherry Hayes-Zorn and Neal Cobb and Jim Bonar with the Nevada Historical Society, and John, our tech wizard from the county, for making this event possible today. Don't forget to sign up for the next live event with the Nevada Historical Society on Thursday, January 21st at 12 p.m. It will be on the Pony Express in Nevada. And to sign up, please visit events.washocountyllibrary.us. If you want to see what's coming up, visit events.washocountyllibrary.us, where you can also access and download our virtual explorer and a publication listing of all our virtual events and resources.